Okay, it's my pleasure to welcome you to Northwood University's 45th Annual Freedom Seminar. This event has a strong tradition here at Northwood, almost as old as the institution itself. My name is Dale Matchek. I'm the chairman of the economics department here at Northwood University, and I'd like to extend a warm welcome to students and faculty and staff, and for those of you who may be visiting here for the first time, welcome. I want to acknowledge the support that made this Freedom Seminar possible, and particularly tonight's lecture. We owe the Mackinac Center for Public Policy our gratitude. I'd like to ask Jarrett Skorup from the Mackinac Center for Public Policy to tell you a little bit about their organization. Jarrett?
I know everybody comes to these because they want to hear the introducer introduce someone else to introduce someone else. So I'll keep it brief. So Mackinac Center, we're a free market think tank here in Midland. Obviously, long time, great relationship with Northwood, many of our staff, and more significantly now, many of our interns. So especially college students, we do paid internships. We have a housing stipend, all sorts of policy areas. We cover fiscal policy, energy, environmental, education, criminal justice. So especially if you want to go to law school, you want to do academic work, right here in town, we have the largest state-based think tank in the country. So for you adults, we hope you follow our programs and support us. And if you are students or no students, we encourage you to check out some of our internships and some of our other programs in public policy research. So thanks for having us tonight, and we're honored to help bring David in.
Thank you, Jarrett. And we also owe a debt of gratitude to the McNair Center for Free Enterprise and Entrepreneurship here at Northwood University for their generous support. And for those of you joining us online, I didn't mean to forget you. Welcome to those of you who are joining us online tonight. Our speaker, our keynote speaker for the seminar is Dr. David Friedman. David Friedman is a bit of a Renaissance man, working in a variety of fields. He's got his degrees in physics. He's an academic economist. He teaches law and economics at Santa Clara University as professor emeritus. He is best known probably for his book, The Machinery of Freedom, A Guide to a Radical Capitalism, first published in 1973. And that includes a description of how society could function without government, merely on the basis of property rights. In that book and in his other writings, he offers a consequentialist defense of libertarianism. His most recent book is Legal Systems Very Different from Ours, which covers systems from Periclean Athens through modern Amish and Romany. He's also the author of 3 novels, and with his wife, a self-published medieval and Renaissance cookbook. So as I said, a man of many interests and talents, and I don't know if he's going to share his recipes with us during his talk, but maybe afterwards. He's widely published in various journals, essays. He's active online in writing, and you can find some of his latest work at his website, daviddfriedman.com. And would you please give a warm welcome with me to Dr. David Friedman.
Our cookbook is a free download from my webpage. Also a printed version from Amazon if you prefer those things. I want to talk about externalities, and I want to explain the basic argument, which is one that's very common in economics, and which is an argument which provides a possible justification for various government activities. And I then want to go on to discuss the problems with applying that argument to issues such as population growth or climate change, which have very complicated effects spread over a long period of time. And we start with the problem that all societies face, what economists call the coordination problem. That is to say, in order to get anything done in a complicated society, you have to somehow coordinate the activities of millions of people. That The classic example is iPencil, which is an essay pointing out that making a pencil requires huge numbers of people because somebody has to cut down the trees to make the wood, make the chainsaw to cut down the trees, make the steel to make the chainsaw, make the gasoline to fuel the chainsaw, et cetera, et cetera. And if you trace it down, somehow a whole bunch of people who don't know each other have to coordinate their activities so that there is enough of what each of them needs for what he's doing produced by each of the others. That's the coordination problem. And there are basically two solutions to it, and the obvious one doesn't work. The obvious solution is centralized control. You have somebody at the top who figures out what everybody should do and makes them do it. That works for very small groups. If you think about a firm owned by somebody with 4 employees, more or less he can tell them what to do. But it scales very badly. And the result, if you try to scale it up to a country, is that you get famines with millions of people dying and other unattractive consequences. The solution which does work is a decentralized solution. And the basic logic of the decentralized solution is that you somehow set things up so that each person who makes a decision bears the net costs of that decision. That he pays for his inputs and gets paid for his outputs, value the cost of the inputs to somebody else producing them, the value of the outputs to somebody else consuming them. And it turns out that a free market comes pretty close to doing that, although by no means perfectly, because if you want inputs, you've got to buy them from somebody, which means you have to offer him a price at which he's willing to sell them, so you can't be making him worse off. When you produce your outputs, you sell them to somebody, and you can charge a price reflecting the value to him. And a full explanation of that is about a year of price theory, or if you prefer, read my book, Hidden Order, which is an attempt to write a book that you read for fun, which is the equivalent of that year of price theory. But the basic logic, I think, is pretty clear. And what I want to talk about is why it doesn't work. And the problem is that there are various situations in which someone is taking an action where either somebody else is paying the cost or somebody else is getting the benefit. And then his incentives are not the same as we would like them to be. I like to describe the general problem as situations where individual rationality does not lead to group rationality, where even if each person is correctly acting his own interest, they're all worse off as a result. And my standard example of that is an army running away. I imagine it's 1,000 years ago. You've got a line of 10,000 spearmen. They're being charged by 10,000 men with spears, with lances on horseback. And each of the spearmen does a quick cost-benefit calculation. And he says, if we run, they'll chase us down and most of us will die. If we stand, with luck, we can break their charge and only a few of us will die. And he then realizes he's doing his calculation wrong, because he doesn't control us, he controls him. And if he runs, one person out of 10,000 has very little effect on the chance that they will break the charge, but if they do, he won't be one of the ones killed, and if they don't, he'll at least be in front, running away. So they all run and most of them die. And that's a nice example of what economists call market failure, which is a situation where individual rationality doesn't produce group rationality. Going back to an ordinary market situation, where the kind of thing you're thinking about is air pollution, for example. And there are basically 3 solutions, 3 approaches to solving the problem. One of them is to have a government decide what people should do and make them do it. That's the regulatory solution. One of them is to have a government somehow measure the costs that are being imposed on other people, impose them back on the person who's doing it in the form of something like a carbon tax, for example, is a standard example of a proposal along those lines. And the third is the Coasian solution, which is for if the number of people involved is small, they can bargain with each other. And if my burning leaves in my lawn is making you cough, then you can pay me not to burn leaves on my lawn, or offer to do something else for me. In some way, people can negotiate to eliminate the undesirable cost. It's pretty clear that that isn't going to work in all contexts. It's sort of hard to do negotiations among all the people who are driving cars in Los Angeles, which produces air pollution. And there are some problems, it turns out, with the other two as well. And the obvious policy activity is that if you can't manage the Cauchy solution, for example, LA air pollution, you either regulate it or tax or subsidize it. And that's what most economists argue is the approach to that. And I want to argue that there are serious problems with that conclusion in the particular case of something like population growth or climate change. In the case of population growth, if you think that on the whole having an extra kid makes the whole society better off, you can try to have baby bounties, you can subsidize people who are having children. If you think it's a problem, you can do what China did and make it illegal for any couple to have more than one child. And you can think of other things along those directions. In the case of global warming, you can have regulations, subsidies for electric cars if you think that they're a good thing. You can have a carbon tax, which is what economists who are in this area tend to argue for. You can have cap and trade, which really turns out to be equivalent to a carbon tax, except that the revenues from the tax are going to the people who are producing the carbon dioxide instead of to the government. But I want to discuss the problem with that. The reason that that method in practice works very badly. And the problem is that what matters are net externalities. That if you have something which produces both good and bad effects, if the net is positive, then it's a positive externality and you want it. If the net is negative, it's a negative externality and you don't want it. And in my experience, both the two issues I mentioned, population and global warming, are actually cases where there are both large negative and large positive effects. Both of them are quite uncertain because they are spread out over a long period of time. And consequently, it is difficult to know what the net is. And I want to start with population, because this is where I first got into this about 50 years ago. At that time, I don't know how many of you realize it, but in the 1960s or early 70s, the dangers of population growth played essentially the same role in the public discussion that the dangers of climate change play now. That is to say, they were what most educated people would say everybody who really knows about this agrees on. And we've got to do something drastic to prevent bad things happening. And the extreme range of what I would think of as respectable opinion was the Ehrlich's book, which claimed that in the 1970s, there would be mass famines with hundreds of millions of people starving to death, and that it was too late to prevent. That the most you could do was to decide which hundreds of millions, triage, so to speak, but that was all. That was within respectable opinion, but at one end of it. But more or less everybody agreed that if population growth was not severely reduced, poor countries were going to get poorer and hungrier, and rich countries would not be as well off as otherwise would be as well. And I was asked by the person who ran the Population Council, which was a private nonprofit involved in these issues, to write a discussion of the issue from the standpoint of somebody who was in favor of free markets, because the people who were writing were mostly on the left. I don't know what his politics were. He was an interesting guy, but I think he mostly just wanted to see he was in favor of diversity, something most people say they're in favor of and aren't. And intellectual diversity, which is what matters. And so I looked at it, and I concluded that it was not at all clear that increasing population made people worse off. That the first argument for it was just a mistake. It was just bad economics. But it was a very obvious and convincing and intuitive mistake, and that was the idea if there are more people, there will be less stuff for each person. There will be less land for each person, less of this and less of that. And the reason that's a mistake is that most of those things are property. Land, for example, is property. And a new baby is not born with a per capita deed to his per capita share of the world's resources clutched in his mouth or even his fist. So that if I produce a child and I want that child to get his share of the world's land, I'm going to have to buy it or rent it from somebody. that means that I or the child is going to have to produce enough wealth to compensate whoever is giving up that land. So that set of things, which I think played a large role in people's intuition, is a mistake, except for resources that aren't property. So that if you imagine, if you're in a socialist society and you have some kind of a sharing rule, then it's true that the extra kid means less per person. It may have other effects as well. Or if you have something which it isn't practical to make private property, for example, fish. There's no very easy way of saying who owns this school of fish out in the ocean, but more people are going to result in fewer fish per person. Second, there were arguments where I think it was a mistake, but a more complicated mistake. And the one that struck me at the time was the effect in the US on public schooling. That the argument was that if I produce another kid, he'll go to the public schools. That will require tax expenditures by other people, so that's a net cost. And the trouble with that argument is that when my kid comes out of the public schools, he will become a taxpayer, and he will now be paying taxes for other people's kids. Then, of course, he'll have kids, but they will become taxpayers and so forth. And I worked it out that if you matched up taxes paid to cost of schooling, roughly speaking, depending on your detailed assumptions about how the cost of schools changed and how incomes changed and stuff like that, roughly speaking, each kid would roughly pay for himself, basically. That he consumes resources when he's going to school, but then produces them going after. So that seemed to me to be also wrong. But then there are real negative externalities. More people, will everything else being equal mean more air pollution? More people, some of those new people might be criminals. They might mug me or mug my kids. Some of them might go on welfare and raise costs for me and my kids. On the other hand, there are also positive externalities. If there are more people paying taxes to pay interest on the national debt, which is already there. There are more people inventing neat new things for me and my kids to make use of. And there are some cases where increasing the size of the market produces a net benefit. If you think about books, for example, the larger the population, the more, everything else being equal, the more authors you have, the more chance of a book being written that you like. And from the standpoint of the authors, the larger the population, the larger the number of potential readers, and therefore the better the rewards to being an author. And you could think about applying that to movies and other things. So there are various cases where increasing the total size of the market produces net benefits. So my conclusion from looking at that was that if I tried to add up the positive and negative externalities, I could not sign the sum. I could not say whether on net more people made me better off or worse off, or other people better off or worse off. And what's interesting about that case is that in a sense we now know the answer. We don't really know the answer. What we know is that the predictions that were made were all wrong. That is to say, the prediction was if population keeps growing, that poor countries will get poorer and hungrier. Population, especially in poor countries, continued growing, and poor countries got less hungry and richer. You look at a graph of extreme poverty. It has, certainly in my lifetime, and maybe even the lifetime of some of yours, dropped drastically across the world. This is the sort of bottom level, and it's I haven't looked up the numbers, but it's something like it went from being 30% of the world population to being 8% of the world population over a period of maybe 40 years. And if you look at the data on calorie consumption per capita, it has generally gone up in poor countries, not down. So we know that the then orthodoxy was wrong. We don't still know for sure whether the net externalities are positive or negative. It could be that things were getting better for other reasons, and if we had held down population, they would have gotten even more better. It could be the other way around. We don't know. But we do know that what people then believed couldn't be true because it led to predictions that turned out to be false. And that experience is one reason why when I got interested in the climate change issue, which would be about, 15 or 20 years ago, I was suspicious of the then orthodoxy. Because I said, I've already seen a situation where there was this publicly popular view, which the New York Times and all of the Harvard professors and lots of other respectable people said was obviously true, and it turned out not to be. Here is another situation like that. I ought to look into it myself. rather than simply accepting what everybody says everybody knows. And so I tried to. I do not think I am competent to evaluate the climatological part of it. That is the question of by how much will temperatures rise. I have looked at how the IPCC's projections compare with what happened after they were made, and they are not doing that badly. That on average they've overpredicted, but the first one they did it pretty badly. But the second, third, and fourth, what happened was within their predicted range, a little lower than they predicted twice and a little higher than they predicted. So I'm willing for my purposes to accept their numbers and to try to go from there. And roughly what those numbers suggest is that by the end of the century, global temperatures will be about 3 degrees higher than they were in the 100 years ago or so, and sea level will have risen by about 1 to 3 feet, about a meter roughly at the upper end. Could be more, but that's what it looks like. So then the first question is there any a priori reason, before we look at numbers, is there any reason to expect that climate change will be bad? And that is not at all clear, that the present climate was not designed for us. We were not designed for it. Our species has existed over and evolved over a period of time in which the climate has changed quite a lot, back and forth with glaciations and interglacials. So as far as I can tell, a priori, there's no reason to believe that the present climate is better for us than it would be if it were 3 degrees warmer or 3 degrees cooler. There is, however, an argument against change. And the argument against change in either direction is that we are presently optimized against our present environment. So where people build buildings near the coast depends on where they think the coastline is. What crops, what varieties of what crops people plant where is determined, among other things, by what the weather is. So there are what kind of houses you build, that if the weather is cold, you put in good heating. If the weather is hot, you put in air conditioning and so forth. So that in general, we're optimized against the present environment, and therefore there is some cost to change. For the economists in the room, think of it in terms of sunk costs. We have borne sunk costs in how we design our houses and what crops we learn to grow and so forth. And some of those sunk costs are not going to give us a return if the circumstances change. On the other hand, that doesn't seem like a very large effect for humans because we're talking about pretty slow change. If you're thinking about change, which is roughly a degree of warming every 30 years or every 25 years maybe, that does not sound as though it's going to be very hard to adapt to. And in fact, if you think about farmers growing crops, farmers will almost certainly have changed their crop variety several times for other reasons by the time that a warming matters very much for what they grow. And in the US, at least, few houses are more than 100 years old. So the odds are that most of the houses will have been torn down and replaced by other houses by the time the coastline has moved enough to matter very much. So I think the conclusion is that there is a cost. A priori, you should expect a cost to change, but for humans, it's not very large. And I keep saying for humans because, of course, climate change will affect other species as well, some of which matter to us. Some of those species can deal with it just fine. Microorganisms, as we have discovered over the last few years to our cost, can evolve very fast. And I have no problem. I expect that the bacteria and the viruses will manage just fine with climate change without any serious problems. Most species of animals can migrate. They don't have to migrate very fast if you're changing temperature by a degree every 25 or 30 years. On the other hand, trees don't migrate very fast. And trees don't evolve very fast because they have long generations. So it is at least possible that climate change might impose significant net costs to trees because those trees are currently optimized against their current environment. And while they can migrate very slowly by growing at one edge and dying at the other edge, that's a costly process. So there are some a priori reasons to expect costs, but my feeling is not very large and not very strong. And then the next thing you can do is to see whether for some of the costs you can actually make some guesstimate about the size of them. And I want to start with the effect of sea level rise. And you can calculate that. I could, on my Substack and on my webpage, I've got some calculations, and it turns out that it's pretty small. That the rule of thumb for the US Atlantic coast, which I happened to come across in a book, is that a foot of sea level rise shifts the coast by about 100 feet. So that means that 3 feet shift it by about 300 feet. And that's a very, very small change. If you think about a map, it's invisibly small. So there will be a few people on the coast, or a few people who happen to be in very low-lying islands, or people who are living on the Florida. If there's anybody in the Everglades, it might well flood by the end of the century. But for most people and most large urban populations, you're talking about a pretty small effect. And if you can look up on, you can use Google to find the elevation of cities, and there are, of course, a number of cities that are well below sea level. They're in the Netherlands, which faced this problem some centuries ago. And New Orleans is below sea level. It's been below sea level for a long time. It's been a disaster waiting to happen for a long time. I lived there for a while, and my wife's a geologist, so I knew all about it. I could discuss that, but it's not very relevant. But basically, the effects of sea level rise are negative, but not very large. But then there's another land effect that's much larger. If you look at a map of the world showing average temperature and a map of the world showing population density, you discover that human settlement is limited by cold and not by heat. That is to say, there are parts of the world which are among the hottest parts of the world. The Philippines is one of them for average temperature, which are densely populated. On the other hand, as you get to the far north, population goes to essentially very close to zero. So that what's going on is the equator is populated, the poles are not populated, and what happens with warming, the temperature contours move towards the poles. That is to say, the place where average temperature used to be 5 degrees is now 6 degrees, 7 degrees, 8 degrees. Furthermore, it turns out that due to the physics of global warming, warming is greater in cold times and places than in hot. And if people are curious, I can explain it has to do with the interaction between water vapor and carbon dioxide and greenhouse gases, both being greenhouse gases. But you can see it very easily if you just look at the IPCC reports, because they have these nice maps, and the maps show their projections for what happens, and you can see that the warming is substantially larger at the poles than it is at the equator. So the result of warming then is that you gain land in the north, the southern hemisphere. There's very little land except in Antarctica, and we're not going to warm enough for a long time to live in Antarctica. But I guess there's a little bit of the southern tip of South America that you might gain. But basically, the relevant thing is in the northern hemisphere. And I did a calculation using maps that showed temperature contours and using the IPCC figures for how much warming you would get where. And it looks to me as though by the end of the century, the amount of land that is warm enough for human life will have increased by about the area of the United States. So it's a much, much larger effect. I think about 2 or 3 orders of magnitude larger effect than the loss of land from sea level rise. Now, of course, you could point out that land that used to be too cold to live in is still not going to be very comfortable to live in, even when you push it up by another 5 or 6 degrees, which is what you're talking about. But on the other hand, at the same time you push the land that was too cold to live on up by 5 degrees, you also push the land just south of it that was barely warm enough to live on up by a similar amount. So on net, you are increasing to a usable level that amount of land in the form of this goes from A to B, this goes from B to C, this goes from C to D. That's just like going from A to D between them. So that turns out to be a very large positive effect, which most people ignore. The negative effect, the one that people keep pointing out, which is real, is that hotter summers result in people dying in very hot weather. But it's also true that milder winters result in fewer people dying of cold. The total globally, the total number of people who die from cold is apparently much larger than from heat. It's not clear whether that's true of the change in total number as you warm or not. And as I pointed out already, you make winters milder by more than you make summers hotter because warming is greater in cold places. And so that it's not clear what the net effect is, but it is clear that there is a large positive effect there on the cold mortality, which to some degree balances or overbalances, we aren't sure, the negative effect from hotter summers. Then there's a big positive effect, which is actually, I suppose, the most unambiguous of all of these, and that is that carbon dioxide is an input to photosynthesis. And it has been established for a very long time that if you increase carbon dioxide, many, though not all, crops yield a larger amount. That in fact, people who have greenhouses sometimes pump CO2 in for that purpose. Roughly speaking, the IPCC expects the CO2 concentration to roughly double by the end of the century, and that's going to increase the yield for what are called C3 plants, which is most but not all crops, by something like 20 or 30%. So it's quite a large effect. It turns out there are two different mechanisms for photosynthesis. Most plants use C3, maize and sugarcane and a few others use C4. And C4 does not get much benefit from the CO2 fertilization, C3 does. Furthermore, more CO2 in the atmosphere means that plants don't have to put as much air through their leaves in order to collect the carbon they need to grow, and the result is that they lose less water. So plants in general, including C4 plants, if they're water stressed, do better with higher CO2. That is, the CO2 reduces the need for water. Then there are a variety of things which are sort of uncertain, and where you get accounts of the negative possibilities, but not much of the positive. So, for example, drought. California is where I am, has been supposedly in drought, but it looks as though that's over for the moment, and probably for a while. How long, we don't know. The summary for policymakers of the last IPCC report shows a lot more increasing drought than decreasing drought. On the other hand, if you actually read, it also mentions that Earth is on net greening. That is to say that more area is covered by leaves than in the past, not less. And almost certain reason for that is CO2 fertilization, which applies to grass as to wheat, and therefore makes things grow better. Hurricanes. There's been a lot of talk about it. One of the things that irritated me in the IPCC summary for policymakers is they have the statement, true statement, I should say, that it's projected that the ratio of high-end tropical cyclones to low-end tropical cyclones will go up. What you have to read the report itself to find out is that the reason the ratio of high-end to low-end is expected to go up is that the number of low-end is going down. That the projection suggests that the number of high-end tropical cyclones is staying at about the same level, number of low-end is going down. Now, I should say, to be fair, they also project that the high ends will get somewhat stronger. So that's a real negative effect. But the idea that you'll have more high-end ones is rhetoric, shall we say, because it's a true statement, but misleading. One of the other things that you are very unlikely to discover if you read news stories about it, because it's not in the summary for policymakers, it's only in the body of the report, is that some but not all projections suggest that climate change will result in greening the Sahara and the Sahel, turning areas that are currently desert into green. And it's clear if you read the discussion in the IPCC report itself that this is not something everybody agrees on. This is something where some projections show it happening and some don't. So my basic point really is that you're going to be having positive and negative effects of quite uncertain size, and that if the externalities are, especially over long time periods when it's hard to predict things, and that therefore it isn't obvious whether the net effect is positive or negative. And what happens in practice is that if you know what answer you want to get, you can get it. So if you start out believing that climate change is bad, you will tend to make generous estimates for the negative effects and tend to make cautious estimates for the positive effects. You'll probably miss one or two positive effects because you're not looking for them, and you'll say, yep, just what I thought. Well, it makes us worse off. I'm not sure if I've found anybody doing the opposite, but I'm sure you could do the opposite if you wanted to and conclude that we should be pumping all the CO2 we can into the air in order to make climate change happen. Let me give some examples. William Nordhaus is an economist who is specialized in trying to calculate the effects of global warming. And in his cost figures, he includes estimates for low probability, high cost effects. That is, things that probably will not happen due to global warming, but conceivably could, and if they did, would be very bad. And it's perfectly reasonable to say, well, if you've got a 1,000-fold negative effect, even at 1%, you ought to include it. As best I can tell, he makes no attempt at all to find low probability, high cost effects of preventing global warming. There is one that should sort of be staring you in the face, because as you may or may not realize, we are all living in an ice age. We've been in an ice age for the last several million years. This is not part of common discourse, but the geologist's definition of an ice age is a time when there is ice on one or both poles, which has not been true for most of the history of the Earth, but they come and go. Ice ages alternate glaciations and interglacials. The glaciation is when the glaciers move from the poles towards the equator, and you get half a mile of ice over the present location of Chicago and London. The interglacials are when it goes the other way. We are in an interglacial, which is sort of nice, especially if you live in Chicago, but which I used to. We are in an interglacial that has been going for at least as long as most of them go. So it is at least possible, I think very unlikely, but possible, that the only thing that's keeping the next glaciation from happening is climate change. We're warming the globe, and that's preventing it. Now, I should say, to be honest, there is actually some very serious research which suggests that what's prevented the interglacial is indeed anthropogenic warming, but it's anthropogenic warming starting about 7,000 years ago. This is the theory of what's referred to as the early anthropogenic theory. And the idea is that when humans discovered agriculture, they started cutting down a lot of trees in order to get fields to grow crops in. And that over a period of some thousands of years, this resulted in increasing CO2. And it turns out if you look at graphs of CO2 levels over the interglacial, typically the CO2 level is falling through the interglacial, which may be one of the things that eventually sets off another glaciation. But this interglacial is different. After about 2,000 years, it turns back up again. So the theory, not clear it's right, but it's a really neat theory, is that we have stopped the glaciers. As I like to put it, humans stopped the glaciers, Stone Age humans. But in any case, but my point is only that as far as I know, Nordhaus did not even consider whether there was any chance that preventing climate change would mean the end of the interglacial, which would be an enormous cost. We know what glaciations are like. We've got geological evidence of repeated ones. And basically what happens is that every sea level drops by about 300 feet, which means that every port in the world is high and dry. And as large parts of the northern and southern hemisphere are covered by ice. So that would be one example where it presumably did not occur to him to try to find such effects, and as far as I can tell, he didn't. Let me give an example, not of a mistake in that case, but examples of what I see as distortions that come out of people knowing what answer they want to get. Nordhaus had a piece in, I don't remember what it was, but it was some very public publication, responding to a Wall Street Journal op-ed, which argued that climate change was not the sort of emergency that required immediate action. And he was disagreeing with that. And as one part of this, if you're sufficiently curious, you can go on my old blog and find my post that discussed it. But part of his argument was, he said, I've done the calculations. If we wait 50 years to do anything about climate change, instead of doing the optimal things tomorrow, the result is that we will be worse off by about $4.1 trillion. And that is the equivalent of that. Obviously not literally money, but it would make us as worse off as if global GNP was decreased by $4.1 trillion over the whole period. And he did not mention that $4.1 trillion spread out over the entire global economy in the rest of the century comes out to about 1/20th of 1% of world GNP. So that what I think is typically true of Nordhaus's work, I think he's honest in the sense that he really gives the numbers, he thinks they're right, but he gives numbers which imply that climate change is a wet firecracker, and then uses rhetoric to try to make it sound as though it's something really serious we have to do something urgent about. Let me take a more recent example, and one which I spent quite a lot of time looking at. There is a recent article in Nature, Rennert et al. 2022, which is an attempt to estimate the cost of carbon. How much worse are we if an additional ton of carbon dioxide goes into the air? And this article is being looked at by the EPA as a possible basis for future regulation. And it came up with a figure about 3.5 times as large as the figure the EPA has been using in the past, which came out of the Obama administration, I think. And I read the article. To begin with, they are calculating costs from now to 2300. And that by itself ought to make you a little skeptical, because it's very hard to know what the world is going to be like 3 centuries from now. But you then look a little more carefully. Half their cost is the cost of increased mortality due to rising temperature. How do they calculate it? They have some figures estimating from past recent history how mortality changes in different places with temperature. One of the things that mortality from temperature or anything else depends on is medicine, right? You die because you got a heart attack or because something else happened. They pay no attention at all to that. And they are doing their calculation on the implicit but unstated assumption that there will be no medical progress for the next 300 years. Well, the next 3 centuries, it's like, what, it's 2300, so it's 270 some years. Similarly, they are making no allowance at all for improvements in insulation or heating or air conditioning over the next 3 centuries. As far as I can tell, the part of their calculation that involves agriculture, which is most of the rest of their calculation, does not seem to allow for improvements in biotech. That after all, maize was originally a tropical plant. It now grows more in temperate regions than in tropical regions. That was the result of primitive biotech over a couple of thousand years of selective breeding, by which maize became more and more tolerant of warm temperatures. It seems to me extraordinarily likely, given what's been happening in the last century, that 50 or 100 years from now we'll be much better at breeding varieties of crops which do better under the changed environmental circumstances, and they are ignoring that effect. Furthermore, vulnerability to temperature partly depends on income. Rich people have air-conditioned houses and don't have to go out in bad weather. The projection in Rennert is that per capita GNP will triple by the end of this century, go up about 11-fold by 2300. They are using figures for the relation between temperature and mortality, which do not include any allowance for income, and therefore are calculating as if that increase in income would have no effect at all. So, to me at least, this seems to be a pretty clear case where they know what answer they want to get, namely a large value of the cost of carbon. If they had found that the cost of carbon was a third the older version rather than 3 times, I don't think they would have gotten published. And it would probably not have been very good for their careers, I would guess. And they would also have felt bad about it because they probably all believe that it's important to deal with climate change, and therefore you've got to persuade people to do something about it. But I think this is a demonstration of the general problem that once you know what answer you want to get, especially if everybody knows, if the referees know and the editors of the journal know, then it is pretty easy to fudge up the answers you want. So my conclusion, at least on climate change, is that I simply do not know what the net effect will be. That the net effect might be positive. It might be lots more food because of CO2 fertilization and lots more land because of climate, of temperature contours shifting towards the North Pole. It might be worse because of negative effects. The negative effect I find it hardest to estimate is what is misleadingly called acidification. That CO2 dissolved in water is carbonic acid. That neutralizes the bases in the seawater. I call it a deceptive term because seawater is in fact basic, not acidic. So what lowering the pH of seawater means is moving it towards neutral. Now, it is true that it is making it more acidic, because less basic is the same thing as more acidic, but then distilled water is more acidic than the ocean too, because it's pH 7, which is neutral. So I think calling it acidification makes it sound as though it's turning into an acid, which is going to eat stuff up, which is false. But what is true is that organisms are adapted to their present environment. One feature of the environment for aquatic organisms is the pH of the ocean. And as far as I can tell, nobody really knows whether lowering the pH by the amount that it's getting lowered as a result of CO2 in the air getting dissolved in the water will or will not have a significant effect on fish, plankton, and various other species that matter to us. So that's one of the reasons why I'm not willing to argue that it probably is positive effect, is that that's a negative effect I just don't know. And another reason is that I probably missed some things. That, you know, this is a complicated world. On the other hand, what I think is pretty clear is that one should not do such calculations beyond at most the end of this century. That technology makes the future very, very uncertain. One of my books is called Imperfect. And in it, I was trying to explore technological revolutions that might happen and what their consequences would be. And I've got a list of them. When I gave a talk at Google on the book, I started out by saying that from my standpoint, climate change was a pretty wimpy catastrophe, that I had 3 ways of wiping out the human race faster than that. And I do. That is 3 technological developments that could happen. If anyone's curious, AI, biotech, and nanotech. If we produce artificial intelligence that keeps getting smarter by Moore's law, in a little while, we'd better hope they like pets. I don't know we're going to, but that's one possible future. If it becomes possible for a bright high school student to create a plague in his basement, which enough improvement in biotech might give us, we should worry about that. And nanotech is the expanded version of biotech, for those who haven't followed it, not limited to carbon. So in any case, when I did Future Imperfect, I mostly limited myself to 30 years. There were 1 or 2 things I had to go farther than that to get interesting, especially space flight, which is not likely to be very interesting in 30 years after that book was written. But in general, I limited myself to 30 years on the grounds that beyond that, technological change made it too hard to predict. And I can see trying to push farther than that. But as far as I'm concerned, anybody who is claiming to do an estimate from now to 2300 should not be trusted. That he's writing science fiction, not science. And if he tries to treat science fiction as science, that means that he's either a enthusiast or a fraud. And if you try to do those estimates, I don't think we can tell whether the net effects are positive or negative. All right, that's basically what I wanted to say, and I'm not sure how long I was supposed to talk, but I've probably talked at least as long as I was supposed to. And I don't think there's anything more to say for this talk. A different talk I could give on market failure is that the general problem with solving market failures by having government action is that the political market is full of market failure. That is to say that the same reasons why the private market sometimes produces the wrong result much more often imply that the political market, which is also a bunch of individuals acting in their own interest, even though they pretend they're not, often produces the wrong result. But I'll leave that for another talk. Or I should say, if you're really enthusiasts, if you go to my webpage, there is a link to videos of lots and lots of talks I've given, and you can undoubtedly find that one if you're curious. I think there's even a recording of a talk on why economics is fun, which economics students might find interesting. Thank you. Can I take questions? Do we have time?
Just raise a hand and I'll bring you a microphone.
I hope I didn't miss it, but how do negative externalities affect the economy? I might have missed it.
I'm not sure what affect the economy means. Negative externalities mean that people are making the wrong decision and on net worse off than if they made a different decision. Economics is not just about the, my standpoint, economics is about the have objectives and tend to act to achieve them. Economics textbook has a discussion on the economics of love and marriage, the economics of crime, a whole bunch of different things. And what we call the economy just happens to be an area of human activity where economics has turned out to be particularly useful. Yeah, another question?
So we see a lot of issues with like people pushing electric cars. Would you say that that is one of the negative arguments or negative impacts that we're going to be seeing? And if so, why are we not kind of trying to stop, like, because the government's giving everyone credits to buy these electric cars. Why are we not trying to stop that more if we have a feeling it's going to be a big negative effect in the future?
That is the argument for the cars is they can produce electricity and produce CO2, whereas gasoline necessarily. So if you believe that climate change is going to have substantial, what the U.S. government pretty clearly believes, and lots of other people believe, then you would like to encourage the use of electric cars. Now, it's not clear how much you want to encourage them, because at the moment, they are mostly getting their power from fossil fuels at the generators. Although I think the calculations suggest that you're probably producing less CO2 per mile than if, but in the ideal world that people are imagining, where you've got enough solar power and wind power and a bunch of other things so that you can charge them up. But no, the electric cars aren't bad, but the basic rule for electric cars should be the same as for everything else. Namely, if it's worth more to people than it costs to produce, they get it. And if it's not worth more to people than it costs, they don't produce it, they don't get it. And when the government says we'll give you a large subsidy for your electric car, that means that even when electric cars cost more than they are worth to the consumer, you still get them. Now, there is the counter argument, which has been going for a long time, which says, yes, but we subsidize them now in order that people may make the technological progress that will make them worth doing in the future. And that's a possible situation, but I don't think the evidence suggests that governments are very good at figuring out what are the things where companies are not making enough investment and they should invest instead. Well, out of case of making electric.
Hi, you had once in an interview talking about Robert Heinlein, you had discussed that you believe that Ayn Rand's philosophy is mediocre, but her prose is actually quite good. Would you mind elaborating on that? Do you still hold that belief, and would you mind elaborating on it?
Yeah, I have a chapter in the third Freedom of Rand. Drought, good and bad. on objective. That is to say, she claims to have. David Hume famously argued that you couldn't get aught from is, the way he put it, but that's the way it's often summarized. And Rand claimed that she did. Claimed that from the nature of humans, from facts about humans, she could prove how one ought to behave. And I believe that that argument doesn't work. And I'm not going to go into detailed critique here, but they went through the version of the argument that's in John Galt's speech, and I think showed that there were gaping holes in that argument. Now, beyond that, I think Rand writes impressively well. In fact, one that she does, and there are holes in her argument, she covers them with beautiful rhetoric, so you won't notice them. And the very fact that she sold a huge number, she's a good writer. She's a very weird writer. She's writing different kinds of things than other fiction that was being written. She was on some television show, and somebody told her that her work was not in the mainstream of American fiction, which Rand replied, and you'll have to imagine the Russian accent, "The mainstream of American fiction is a stagnant swamp." Disagree with her. But there are other things I disagree with her about. In particular, she rejected anarchy, and I don't reject anarchy as a possible system. But the really important thing, I think, is her claim to have derived what one ought to do.
So it seemed like throughout the talk, there was an assumption that technology will continue to progress the way it has in the last 100 years. But there are some who would argue that we're living at the end of that age, and that there have been ages in human history of technological boom, and that they tend to fall into a dark age eventually.
I don't think the latter is. I don't think dark. Pop years for Europe. It starts back up about 200 years after the fall of the Roman Empire, as usually, and was falling during the Roman Empire, during the late Roman Empire. So, I think the whole Dark Ages, etc., picture of history is leading. But that aside, it's certainly possible that technological change will slow. I don't know if it'll continue as fast as it has been, but I think it's very unlikely that it will stop, because we can see what's happening. Various ways in which people know much more about genetics than they used to, and they have the tools to know more about genetics. And so it seems to me quite unlikely. And of course, civilization. So even if something goes wrong with the U.S., well, there's still Singapore and China and England and a whole bunch of other places, and it's unlikely that the same things will go wrong with all of them at the same time. India is coming along pretty well now. So I think is that it's not logically impossible, but I don't see, and I don't think there was much technological regress during the Dark Ages. In fact, I think that there were a few. It wasn't that useful to be able to build roads when you didn't have the kind of large state which could support roads. But the military improved with the invention of ships. I can't think of any. They invented the chimney, the chimney fireplace, which didn't exist in antiquity. There's a wonderful discussion somewhere of technological change, which points out that the early Middle Ages, the way you heated a big hall was you had a fire down the middle and holes in the roof, and that meant you had one big room that everybody was living in. And was the inventor of the mantle and chimney fireplace did more for courtly love than all the troubadours, because now you could have multiple rooms in your castle.
You spoke a lot about how CO2 production could increase our crop output. Do you foresee a time where the CO2 production outweighs what the crops can handle? Do you think there's ever going to be a point where...
The thing is, CO2 is a trace gas of the atmosphere. So that means that doubling CO2 has very little effect on the amount of oxygen around. That's something I think people often get wrong. So I don't think we know And there certainly is controversy about this. There's a really neat paper which tried to do it not by a controlled experiments. They had light data which showed CO2 concentration at different locations changes randomly somewhat. And they had crop yield data they used that CO2 increasing experiments had. But that was only looking at low levels of CO2. You don't have anywhere where it's twice the 5%. I think do go up to twice. Yes, I'm not an expert on that, right? There are lots of things I'm not an expert on. Part of the interesting.
You've mentioned Moore's law as it relates to AI. I'm very interested in your argument on how we should shape a future of AI, since we seem to be embarking on that already. Well,
Imagine sort of a person. Have unattractive results. That being one of the possible outcomes. You are likely to say, stop this train, I want to get off. This train is not equipped with brakes. The reason the train is not equipped with brakes is we've got lots of different countries in the world. As long as the technology provides benefits to those who do that, it is going to be very hard to slow any technology. So I think it makes a lot of sense to try to predict and try to say, if I expect this to happen, what should I do? But I think it's rarely going to be practical to say, well, I don't like the result of this technological change, let's keep things from being discovered. I'm not sure it never happens, but it's awfully hard to do. And there, as you may know, there's a fairly lively discussion that's been for a fair while over the issue of how you can make sure that if you create very smart AIs, they're on our side. And the worry, one worry that you get some intelligent people offering is that you create a very smart AI, program it to achieve some objective. And it then turns out that the best way of achieving that objective is to kill all the humans. Or to do something else we don't like. And it's smarter than we are, so it can work around us and do what it wants. And that's sometimes called the alignment problem. And there's been, probably if you looked up alignment problem, if you haven't, if you Google for it, you could find a bunch of this literature. It's not something I've really been involved with other than as an observer. But I could certainly imagine a future where you get human level AI and it then keeps getting smarter and we don't. And as you may know, Kurzweil, who's been one of the people who's been involved in a lot of this his solution to that is that we become AI too. That is to say that we get better and better mind to machine links. See, there's a sense in which we already are. I mean, I do a bunch of my, oh, it's the wrong thing, sorry, wrong pocket. I do a bunch of my thinking in this. It told me, for example, yesterday that it was only a little over a 2-hour drive from Detroit to here, which is why I knew that it was worth seeing if I could get an Uber to do it after I missed my connection. And so to some extent, we're already using computers to make ourselves smarter. And Kurzweil's idea is you could do it in such a way that you didn't need the physical interposition. You had some way in which your brain could link to a computer. Then as the computers get faster, we get smarter, and there's no problem. So that's one possible solution. Another possible is it may turn out you can't make human equivalent AIs. We don't really understand ourselves very well. I would have said that the biggest hole in my world view of the world is that I don't understand consciousness. I don't understand how it can be that there is a person here looking out of my eyes, and yet I know that more certainly than anything else, because that's sort of the first step. And so maybe it'll turn out that we can't do anything something like humans. Now, some people will say, well, that's all right. It doesn't have to be conscious. It only has to have objectives. You can program objectives into software. and then it becomes dangerous again. I should say my younger son, I think, is of the opinion that the world will probably end in a few decades for this reason. But I think he is too confident.
How would you recommend to increase intellectual diversity within an organization?
A good question. That is, the obvious way is by not filtering it out. And I think we often filter it out by, if you're trying to hire physicists, ignore the question of what their religious beliefs are or their political beliefs are. You don't really care whether a physicist believes in evolution or not, because he's not doing anything that evolution depends on. So I think in general, being more tolerant of people who disagree with you about things that aren't relevant to what you're hiring them to do would be the first step. And my impression is that, as a rule, people in organizations that say they're in favor of diversity are not. That the hypothetical I like to give is, suppose you're hiring for an academic position, and you find two candidates who seem about equally well qualified for the position. And then you discover that one of them is an intelligent and articulate defender of South African apartheid. Does the chance of hiring him go up or down? And I know the answer. In pretty much any American university, it goes sharply down. But if you're in favor of intellectual diversity, it should go up, because none of us ever heard a good argument for that position. And people will say, well, I know there couldn't be a good argument, so we must be stupid. And then say, well, how many smart people have you argued with who held that position? And none. Then how do you know it's not defensible? So I think a lot of it really would be that attitude. A long time ago, I was invited to participate in some sort of a conference in Paris. And a little before it happened, I was told that a bunch of the people had canceled because they were protesting the fact that one of the people invited was somebody who they regarded as a fascist. And my reaction was, that's a reason to go. I've never talked to a fascist. And I ended up going. I don't remember if the conference happened or not, but I did get to have dinner with the fascist. And he wasn't a fascist. He was crazy, but he was crazy in a different way. He was somebody who believed that the peak of civilization was classical antiquity. And he wasn't really anti-Semitic, because he was just as anti-Christian. That, paganism was better. And he had the picture of the U.S. as sort of coast-to-coast McDonald's. And I told him about my hobby, which was historical recreation, which includes cooking from 10th century cookbooks and making furniture based on Renaissance paintings and fighting with swords and shields in a form that doesn't actually kill you, but is a sport. And I think he found that very interesting. It's a picture of an America that was not what he thought America was like. But that was much more interesting than talking to somebody who agreed with me, or even who disagreed with me in a conventional way that I was used to arguing with.
Dr. Friedman, thank you so much for the fascinating stories. I want to take you to one area that we haven't had the chance to discuss yet, but I promise the audience will do something about it. So it's about COVID. Everybody remembers how it started 3 years ago in March. It started with 2 weeks to flatten the curve. It escalated into more than 2 years of terrorizing several billion people for the sake of submitting them to whatever the elites wanted to be achieved at that time. Now, the way that they sold it was using the externality argument.
That's right.
If I go out of my house, if I choose to ignore the warnings, if I decide to take the risk,
Yes.
I am, according to their logic, I am threatening other innocent people who are scared of that virus. So how would you...
The right conclusion from that is that I will take fewer precautions than are optimal. Because a good deal of the cost of my getting COVID goes to me, especially to me because I'm old and therefore actually had a chance of dying, which you people, most of you didn't really. But some of the cost goes to other people who might get it from me. And therefore I will take fewer than optimal precautions. That doesn't say what the optimal precautions are. And you ought to think about the fact that when the decision is being made by Mr. Fauci or other people, other authorities, they don't have the right incentives either. That if I stay in and don't do social things, that's not a cost to Fauci. And it is not at all clear that I mean, let's take the extreme case, the government, well, let me take maybe the most extreme case. People talk about how amazing it is that we got a vaccine in less than a year. The truth is that we got a vaccine in less than a week. That's how long it took to produce the first of what ended up as a successful vaccine. The rest of the time was first testing what you had to do to make sure that the vaccine wasn't dangerous and worked, and second, getting approval. How do they get approval? Well, the sort of gold standard for testing whether a vaccine is safe is that you have a blind experiment in which you vaccinate, you get a whole bunch of people, you randomly vaccinate half of them, don't vaccinate half of them, and don't tell them which is which. You don't tell your people which is which, you keep that as a written text somewhere or a computer text somewhere. You wait long enough so that by natural processes, enough of them will have gotten COVID so you can tell whether the vaccine is protecting them, which means you wait several months at least. And you then analyze the data and see whether the vaccine reduces the number of people who get COVID. And this is a perfectly sensible, highly rigorous procedure, but not when you're losing thousands of people a day. All right, the fast way of doing it is you get volunteers, you inoculate the volunteers with the vaccine, you deliberately expose them to COVID, you compare the results of that to the evidence of what you can see of people who get exposed to COVID in hospitals and places like that, and you then have a noticeably less rigorous answer, but you get that answer 3 months earlier. So that would be the clearest case, where the people who were making the rules were not the people who were likely to die because their rules was being too cautious. Another case early on that you may have followed was that at the beginning of COVID, the US, the FDA, I think, said that there was only one test for COVID they had approved, and you were not allowed to use any other test. There were other tests being used elsewhere in the world. After a while, I think maybe 2 or 3 weeks, maybe a little longer than that, they confessed that it turned out that the test that they had approved didn't work. So that cost us 2 or 3 weeks of people knowing whether they had COVID and taking precautions if they did. So in general, I think it is true that a sufficiently wise dictator could improve on the outcome of the markets. That's usually true. That's just to say that market failure exists. But we don't have any sufficiently wise benevolent dictators. We only have human beings acting on their own incentives, and I cannot see any evidence that doing that is going to come closer to the optimal than leaving people alone. I should say a couple of things about Fauci. Fauci has publicly stated, and we didn't put it that way, in a New York Times interview that he lies to the public. What he actually said was that he had been estimating the number, the infection rate necessary for herd immunity at, I don't remember what it was, maybe at 60 or 70%. But he had now seen polling evidence showing that more people were being willing to be vaccinated before, so he was going to raise his estimate of what was required for herd immunity. That makes no sense at all if he's telling us what's true, because how many people are willing to be vaccinated has no effect on what infection rate is necessary for herd immunity. It only makes sense if he's saying, I would like to push the number up, and this polling evidence suggests that I can get away with it. It's in my interest to have people believe a different thing. So I thought that what was really extraordinary was not that he was acting that way. Lots of people lie in public. But that it didn't occur to him that he shouldn't pretend he wasn't. And also, of course, it's now pretty clear that Fauci was fraudulently promoting the idea that COVID did not come from experiments at the Wuhan Institute of Virology. That as far as we can tell from the emails between him and the people who were involved in the correspondence, they went from it could well be a lab leak, though we aren't sure, to it's not a lab leak with no additional evidence. That was a policy decision. And it is now finally being conceded that very likely it was a lab leak. We'll never know for certain, I think, unless the WIV tells us, which I don't think is likely to happen. But it was perfectly clear that since the people he was associated with had funded some of the research at WIV, he really didn't want us to believe that that had created a lockdown. So The lockdown was probably a mistake. I don't think we know for sure. Clear whether masking was a mistake. As far as I can know, there's no good evidence that mask mandates work. There is some evidence that masking works, but of course the mask mandate means that people, many of whom are only doing it because the mandate are masking. And what do you do that? Well, you take a handkerchief and you put it over your mouth, and now you're officially masking. And of course, if people believe masking works, they're then less willing to avoid getting close to other people and more willing to go into crowded circumstances. So it's not clear what the net effect of the mask mandates was, but there's not much evidence that it was desirable. And if it wasn't, Fauci and other people making said recommendations are not likely to suffer any serious costs. He's suffering some embarrassment now because he pushed fairly hard on it's not being a lab leak and now becoming increasingly accepted that it was.